Today, we're going to be talking about American Airlines Flight 191, a case study by Melvin Abreu. Some background information about Flight 191. The date of the accident was May 25th, 1979. The aircraft was the McDonnell Douglas DC-10. The route was from Chicago O'Hare to Los Angeles International Airport. There were 3 flight crew members aboard and 10 flight attendants. All 258 passengers and 13 crew members were unfortunately killed in the accident. The crash site was about 4,600 feet off of runway 32 right. Some background of the flight crew. There was Captain Walter Lux. He was 53 years old and he had 22,000 flight hours. 3,000 of those hours were in the DC-10. He was also qualified to fly the DC-10, DC-6, DC-7, and Boeing 727. There was also First Officer James Dillard. He was 49 years old. He had 15,000 total flight hours. He had 915 hours in the DC-10. He was also qualified to fly the DC-10, DC-6, and Boeing 767. Lastly, there was Flight Engineer Alfred Udovich. He was 56 years old. He had 9,275 total flight hours, and 915 of those hours were in the DC-10. So the flight engineer and the first officer were on the same caliber in the DC-10, meaning they had the same amount of hours, but Captain Walter Lux, he had the most hours in the DC-10, and he is rated to fly 3 different types of McDonnell Douglas aircraft, so he was no stranger to McDonnell Douglas aircraft in general. How the accident happened. The pilots normally took off of runway 32 right. Just as the pilots started to lift off the ground, engine 1 and the pylon assembly ripped off the wing, going over the top of the wing and taking 3 feet of the leading edge with it. As soon as the pilots took off, 30 seconds after takeoff, they called engine failure and hydraulic system failure, although the aircraft did start to continue the climb normally. After about 30 seconds, the plane started turning to the left, and it had 112 degrees of bank, and the nose of the plane started to go down. At this point, the pilots did everything they could to try to recover from the steep bank angle, and they couldn't. They hit the ground at 190 miles an hour and just 4,600 feet off runway 32 right. They only reached about 400 feet AGL before slamming into the ground. Why the accident happened. The NTSB conducted an investigation and confirmed that earlier on in the year, the DC-10 went under routine service and had the engine and pylon assembly removed for inspection and maintenance. McDonnell Douglas, the aircraft manufacturer, had specific procedures of how to remove the engine and pylon before any maintenance was conducted. American Airlines, along with Continental Airlines, came up with their own procedure to save over 200 hours of labor and money. When the engine and pylon were being removed, there was a shift change in between removing it, and the pylon was being jammed into the wing, and no one was watching them while the mechanics were jamming the pylon into the wing, and they were creating damage. They also didn't remove the pylon and the engine in 2 separate parts. They just removed it all in one part and then put it back onto the wing all in one part, when McDonnell Douglas had suggested that they remove them separately and then put them back together separately. After the aircraft was approved for service, a few months after, it started developing fatigue, and the aircraft wasn't due for service until the year after in March. The NTSB also confirmed that the pilots could have made it back to the airport with only 2 engines. If the pilot would have maintained excess airspeed, the accident may have not happened in the first place. I applied the Swiss cheese model to Flight 191. There was unsafe supervision. No one was watching the mechanics to make sure that they were putting the pylon and the engine in the aircraft safely, or they didn't follow the instructions. I mean, of course, they were following the instructions that American Airlines gave them. So American Airlines should have followed the manufacturer's guidelines into how to remove the engine and the pylon from their aircraft. Since they are the ones who built it, they're the ones who know the best way to take their engines and other aircraft parts from the actual aircraft. Some NTSB recommendations were to manufacturer quality control programs to ensure full compliance with approved manufacturing and specifications, meaning airlines cannot deviate from what the manufacturer tells them if they're going to do routine service. Special instructions of structurally significant components following maintenance affecting these components. The last recommendation that I chose was the appropriateness of permitting on-condition maintenance, and in particular, the validity and sampling inspection as it relates to the direction of damage which could result from undetected flaws or damage to structurally significant elements during the manufacture or maintenance. I did an interview with Captain Mike Moscovich. He was a retired Boeing 757 captain. He worked for United Airlines, and I asked him some general safety questions about aviation, and I also asked him what his thoughts were on American Airlines Flight 191. I proceeded to start with, do you think aviation is safer than ever? He says, yes and no. There are thousands of flights every day that make it to the destination in one piece, but anything can happen at any given moment, and sometimes it's out of the pilot's hands, and they do everything they could to try to avoid an accident from happening, but sometimes what they do isn't enough. I then proceeded to ask, what are your thoughts on American Airlines Flight 191? He says, in my opinion, I don't think that the pilots could have recovered from such a steep angle like that, especially at 400 feet AGL. Even if the simulator suggests that the pilots could have made it back to the airport, at the end of the day, only the pilots really know what was going on in the cabin. My last question for him was, what would you do to prevent an accident like this from happening again? He then said, I would definitely implement new procedures when it comes to mechanic supervision and making sure that they put everything right back to where it needs to be without screwing it up. My thoughts on Flight 191 were, in my opinion, I think the pilots did the absolute best that they could. Obviously, the NTSB would disagree with me, but as Mike said, they are the only ones who really know what was going on in the cabin, and they are the only ones who could have stopped the accident from happening, and I'm pretty sure they would have stopped the accident from happening if they could. I would recommend that airlines always take into consideration what the aircraft manufacturer says about taking apart their airplanes, especially after an accident at this magnitude. Lastly, I have a video of National Geographic. They did aircraft investigations. They had this whole show on it, and they did a simulation of what they think happened during this crash. So as you can see here, they simulate the pylon and the fatigue, and you can see the engine flying over the wing, bouncing down the runway, the aircraft taking off normally, as you can see here, the pilots are struggling. They're trying to recover and they can't. Here's an actual image of the plane taken from someone just watching from the sidelines.